Barry Shaw, Israel Institute of Strategic Studies, and this is The View from Israel. Benny Gantz, Israel's defense minister, recently put 6 Palestinian NGOs posing as human rights organizations on the terror list, declaring them effective arms of the PFLP, a designated terror organization, not only in Israel, but other countries as well. This has, of course, set off a firestorm of protests, despite ample evidence of the hybrid nature of terror organizations, particularly anti-Israel organizations and terror groups such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and other groups. Foreign governments, left-leaning or NGOs, and the biased media took the usual knee-jerk reaction of blasting Israel as if we'd done something wrong, when facts and details show that the real criminals are the well-funded Palestinian NGOs posing as civil rights groups, but are really a front in active support of designated anti-Israel, anti-Semitic terror organizations. EU governments have given over 200 million euro to groups with links to the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The UN has given more. This according to NGO Monitor. And that's only the tip of the financial iceberg being pumped into manufacturing anti-Israel propaganda and financing the activities of lethal terror organizations, including the indoctrination, recruitment of new fighters and terrorists. Now, unfortunately, Barry Gantz didn't spell out the evidence and the detail of how these 6 NGOs are aiding and abetting terrorists while hiding behind the guise of being human rights groups. Gantz is, after all, not in the business of public diplomacy. He's in the business of keeping Israelis safe from Palestinian terror. So, in the interest of picking up the slack, Israel Institute of Strategic Studies has prepared this video to show you how these so-called human rights groups are tied like a Gordian knot to what is known in the security business as hybrid terror. And to help me deliver you the intelligence behind the naming of these NGOs as terror groups, I've invited as my guest a man with a long history of being intimately involved with Palestinian terrorism. Welcome to The View from Israel, Morris Hirsch.
Hi, good afternoon, Barry.
Thank you for joining me. Now, tell us a bit about your background in bringing Palestinian terrorists to justice.
So my background in the field of fighting terrorism really starts in 1997 when I joined the IDF. I immediately joined the IDF MAG Corps. In my first position, I served as the assistant to the legal advisor for Judea and Samaria, dealing with security and terrorism issues. For 5 years, that was my position, fighting terrorism in all of its different forms. I thereafter spent 4 years in the prosecution for Judea and Samaria, prosecuting terrorists, and then after a few stints in other positions, some of which were relevant, some of them less relevant, excuse me, I then returned to be the head of the prosecution for Judea and Samaria in 2013, prosecuting most predominantly terrorists.
Okay, so let's begin by talking about the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the background, a part of their deadly terror history, to show how they deservedly designated a terrorist organization, as I said before, not only by Israel, but by the United States, Canada, and other nations as well.
So the PFLP really does have a very rich history in its involvement in terrorism, dating back already to the mid-60s, from people like Laila Khaled hijacking aeroplanes. Obviously, hijacking aeroplanes didn't stay in fashion for very long, and the PFLP turned and focused its terrorism more to Israel and to carrying out terrorist attacks in Israel. Just over the last 20 years, for example, if we look at the main terrorist attacks that they've carried out, obviously the first one is the murder of Israel's Minister of Tourism, Rehavam Ze'evi, in 2001. Thereafter, a number of attacks carried out in the name of the organization through the period of the PA-instigated terror war 2000 to 2005. More recently, the attacks that have really dominated the focus of the PFLP was the attack in 2014 in a shul in Har Nof, a neighborhood in Jerusalem, and most recently, the murder of Rina Schnurb, 19-year-old Rina Schnurb, an attack carried out by PFLP terrorists in August 2019. They sat and watching a popular spring that many Jews came to, and planted a bomb at the entrance to the spring. They then sat on the hill watching as Jews came along to the spring, and as Rina and her family, she was there with her father and her brother. As Rina passed by, they pushed the operational button on the bomb, exploding it. Rina was murdered at the site, and her brother and her father were seriously injured.
Okay, now this is where we begin to educate not only the public, but the media, diplomats, politicians, all who seem to be in denial that there can be any stain of violence and terror by NGOs who, after all, are trying to best as they can help poor Palestinians survive against oppressive actions of Israel. So at least that's what they claim. So let's start putting the record straight. Benny Gantz, the Defense Ministry, the IDF, have named 6 specific Palestinian NGOs, all having very close, even embryonic links to the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So let's begin with the NGO Adamir. What can you tell us about Adamir?
So before we start, Barry, I think before we start delving into the individual NGOs, we have to give a little bit of a foreword as to how terrorist organizations work. Terrorist organizations are not only made up of the terrorist who goes out into any scene and pushes the gun or pushes the trigger on a gun or pushes the operational button on an explosive. Terrorist organizations work through a web of different organizations that all act together for the same goal. In most organizations, there are the foot soldiers, the people who actually go out and murder people, but behind them is an entire infrastructure that provides different services, all designed and focused on enabling the terrorist to carry out his work and ensuring that the terrorist organization will continue to be able to recruit terrorists. This is clear also with the Hamas. Hamas, as its main core, is possibly the Izzadin al-Qassam, the military wing of Hamas, but it's supported by a political wing. It's supported by an entire slew of different organizations that, for the more Islamist organizations, is called Dawah, which is really preparing people to understand and accept the operations of the organization. They do that by providing services, almost innocent services, to the local population. But the goal is to make sure that that population is beholden to and supported of the terrorist organizations. The PFLP is not different on that front. The PFLP has its foot soldiers who go out and murder people. But the organizational spectrum of PFLP organizations is much wider than the foot soldiers. There are the organizations that deal with campaigning to bring in money to the organizations. There are the organizations that provide the security, the security net for the terrorists after being caught, whether it be providing money to their families or providing them with legal representation. Everything focused to make sure that the terrorist knows that he's part of an organization. That organization has octopus-like tentacles that go in every direction, and that those tentacles take control and care of everything that the terrorist needs. They provide him with the money that he needs in order to build the bombs. They provide him with the money that he needs in order to make sure that his family is secure. They provide him with legal advice and legal representation after he's been caught. They provide him with every aspect of his life covered and focused on reaching the goal, which is terrorism. That's the goal. There is no other goal. For the PFLP, the stated goal is the destruction of the state of Israel using means of terrorism. That's the PFLP. Now, within that more general framework, we have, again, the foot soldiers and we have the NGOs. Now we can go to the specific NGOs, the 6 NGOs that Benny Gantz recently declared as terrorist organizations and as integral parts of the PFLP. Now, this needs to be understood. These are, to an extent, new designations, but really what Benny Gantz is saying is that these organizations, never mind what they name themselves or how they present themselves externally, really these organizations are an integral part of the PFLP and as such come under almost the original designation of the PFLP as a terrorist organization, whether it be in Israel, whether it be in the States, or whether it be in Europe. And that must be understood. You cannot separate off the NGOs and say they are a separate entity, they are a new entity. That's not true. They are an integral part of the PFLP mechanism and have been since they were created. Before I get into the really the minutia of the connections of Adamir, for example, to the PFLP, I can tell you just an anecdote from my term serving as in the prosecution. When we put in an indictment into the courts, we always knew to evaluate whether the content of the indictment was, to a certain extent, already justified merely by the identity of the lawyers who came to represent the terrorists in court. We had, for example, a female lawyer who she represents and only represents terrorists from Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We have other lawyers who only represent terrorists from Hamas. We have other lawyers who represent people who are, or terrorists who are associated with Fatah. And then you have the lawyers who are associated with representing members of the PFLP. Now, what do I mean on this front? That when you put in an indictment and it says that the terrorist is a member of the PFLP, and the lawyer that turns up to represent those terrorists time after time after time after time are the same lawyers, and they are all members of Adamir. From that, you already understand on the most basic level, just of a prosecutor, of someone who has just a basic understanding of how terrorist organizations work and how similar terrorist organizations like Hamas, like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, how they work and how they employ in-house lawyers for their terrorists, you understand already very quickly that Adamir is a branch of the PFLP. That's on the very most simple level. It's almost akin, and this is something which people have to understand. It's when does a crime syndicate outsource its work to a lawyer to whom they have no contact with? And on which instances do they use an in-house lawyer that represents and knows the internal workings of that crime syndicate? A terrorist organization is very similar to a crime syndicate, just using violent means with no goal of reaching any type of profit, just of murdering the other side. In this case, it's the PFLP trying to murder Jews, and the terrorists being represented by Adamir. Now, from that basic understanding, we can now maybe go on a little bit and discuss Adamir and how the personnel in Adamir are so integrally connected to the PFLP. Let's start, for example, with a woman called Khalida Jarrar. Khalida Jarrar is a self-confessed terrorist. I was involved in a prosecution in 2014-15. She admitted to holding a senior position in the PFLP. She has recently been convicted again of holding a senior position in the PFLP. This time, what she confessed to really is that she posed as the head of the PFLP that isn't in prison. The head of the PFLP really is this guy called Ahmed Saadat, a terrorist who was responsible for the murder of Rehavam Zevi, and he has been in jail since Yasser Arafat put him in prison in 2001, and has been in an Israeli jail since 2006. He was sentenced to over 30 years in prison for his membership in the PFLP. But since he's in prison, there needs to be someone in the outside who's running the organization. That is Khalida Jarrar. Now, Khalida Jarrar, alongside being a member of the PFLP and alongside being the head of the PFLP, was also elected to the parliament of the Palestinian Authority on the ticket of the PFLP. In the recent elections that were meant to be held in May, Khalida Jarrar was one of the senior members of the PFLP on the PFLP list. There is no question that Khalida Jarrar is a PFLP member. She is everything for the PFLP. Her involvement in the PFLP starts in the morning when she wakes up and ends the next morning when she wakes again from her sleep. It doesn't stop. There's no way of separating her activities from the PFLP. Khalida Jarrar also happens to be, or was for a very long time, the vice president and one of the founders of Adamir. Now, that shouldn't shock anyone, because what Khalida Jarrar does is PFLP. What she sets up is PFLP organizations. The PFLP organizations that she heads are clearly involved in that more general idea of the PFLP activity. Now, alongside Khalida Jarrar and her terrorist activities, you have other people like Abdelatif Reh, who is also a senior member of the PFLP, who was also on the board of directors of Adamir. You have other people like Salah Hamouri, a convicted terrorist who spent time in prison for an attempt on the life of Israel's Sephardic chief rabbi, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, many years ago. And he is a field operative researcher for Adamir, convicted of membership in the PFLP. In previous years, they had other members of their legal team, a guy called Ayman Nasser, who was also convicted. I had also took part in that personally, for membership in the PFLP. All of these people who their day job doesn't separate from their ideology and from their PFLP affiliations. They are openly PFLP affiliates. They are openly, integrally, and as you said correctly, Barry, connected with the Gordian cord to the PFLP, posing as civil rights activists, posing as human rights activists. One of the Israeli ministries just recently defined or coined the term, they're just terrorists in suits. They're just terrorists in suits. That's every single one of them. I can carry on going through of more of the connections of Adamir, but we need to focus specifically maybe on one other name, and that's the name of Samer Arbid. Now, I mentioned in my opening words the fact that Samer Arbid, or that there was an attack in 2019 in which Rina Schneub was murdered. The terrorist who initiated that idea and who carried it out was Samer Arbid. He managed to recruit two people from the ranks of the PFLP to carry out the attack with him, and then also recruited the people above him in order to make sure that he had the backing of and the approval of the PFLP, and that the attack would be carried out in the name of the PFLP. Samer Arbid, for an extended period of time, was the accountant of Adamir. When you look at every single person who works within that whole framework, you see that the connections are never ending. You also had a period of time where the daughter of Ahmed Saadat also worked for, and I think to this day works for, Adamir. So here you have an organization which is completely controlled by PFLP members of the PFLP who are part of both the political echelon, members of the PFLP who are part of the foot soldiers actually murdering people, and everything in between. That's what you see in Adamir. Now they present themselves as a human rights organization, and you examine their financial reports, and you see how much money goes in and how little content actually goes out. So where is that money going? That's the question that everyone needs to be asking themselves, based on the budget of Adamir, and then look at the final product. Even with the trips that they take abroad, there is no way to justify the budget they have and the output that they provide. The understanding, obviously, is that part of that service that the Europeans are paying for, they're paying for legal representation of PFLP terrorists by members of the PFLP, keeping the whole story internal. And this is something which is fundamental to terrorist organizations. When a member of a terrorist cell and an organization is arrested, the first and really the most important interest of the terrorist organization is to have a lawyer representing them talk to the terrorist and understand the depth and breadth of the investigation, how much has been exposed, and how many other potential members of the terrorist organization are in danger. This is the importance of having a legal branch that is an integral part of the terrorist organization. And as I mentioned previously, every one of the terrorist organizations has that connection. Now, most of what I'm saying to you now is stuff that you can find in open sources. As Barry mentioned, as you mentioned previously, Barry, most of these sources are on the website of NGO Monitor. You can look up any one of them and find these connections. I have a little bit of an extra input into these things because of my background fighting terrorism, my understanding of terrorism, and the fact that at critical times in the history of Adamir and in the involvement of their members in terrorist activities, I was head of the prosecution, and I was also privy to information which isn't openly available. But I have to stress, when Benny Gantz designated all of these 6 organizations as terrorist organizations, he used both open source material and confidential material. There is a wealth of confidential material that exists here. That is information which cannot and would not be shared with foreign countries. For example, we've seen in the aftermath of the declaration or the designation of these 6 terrorist organizations that one of the countries to which Israel did provide information leaked a 74-page document, ostensibly. That's the report in the news. I haven't seen the document. I'm not privy to that document. Leaked that document to the press and to the terrorist organizations. And they complain that in those documents, there's no smoking gun. So what you can clearly say is that, firstly, when from open sources, you can clearly see the identity between PLO activists, PLO operatives, PLO political echelon, PLO terrorists, literally pushing the buttons to activate bombs, and they are all working in these organizations. It is already, I think, reasonable to assume that there is a direct connection between these organizations and the PFLP. When you add on to that intelligence information from sources which their exposure would endanger the lives of intelligence sources or would compromise intelligence gathering capabilities that the state of Israel has, then obviously you realize, definitely based on the fact that these reports were leaked to representatives of the terrorist organizations, that this is not information which can be openly shared with the political echelon of foreign governments. Some, I assume, work has been done sharing intelligence information between intelligence agencies, but I doubt that we will ever see in an open source an entire overview of what exactly was the cause for the designation of any one of the six terrorist organizations as terrorist organizations and detailing their links to the PFLP. Sometimes we'll only get a small insight. Where did the money go? Where did the money come from? What activities were shown for the money that was gathered? And in some cases like that, there was recently a conviction of one of the people who played an integral part in this massive machine of campaigning and collecting donations from the international community. She was convicted by her own confession just a few days ago. Her name is Juana Rashmawi. She's of Spanish. She has Spanish citizenship, but she's also a Palestinian, married to a Palestinian. And she described how she worked for one of the PFLP organizations, how senior members of the PFLP were aware of the fact that they were gathering money on false pretenses, claiming to do one thing, but really providing falsified documentation to the international community in order to gather in those donations. Now, that became public only after the designation of those six organizations, and obviously, since it's something which could not necessarily be shown as a clear basis for the designations already 2 or 3 weeks ago, then this is something which adds on and continuously adds on to the proofs that these organizations are integrally and internally connected to the PFLP. Those are the connections of Adamir, and we can find those same connections really to a great extent with every single one of the six organizations that were designated. There have been previous designations, like, for example, a few months ago, Samidun, another PFLP connected organization, was also designated as a terrorist organization. A few months ago, there was already another designation. A few months ago, some 20 odd months ago, there was a designation of another a branch of the PFLP as a terrorist organization. In 2015, in Israel, the health committees was designated as a terrorist organization connected to the PFLP. We're talking about really, the focus now is only on these six organizations, but we're really talking about a wide spectrum of organizations that have played an integral part in funding, to a great extent, the activities of the PFLP, no matter what those activities be, whether they be ostensibly legitimate activities or whether they be violent activities and the murder of Jews. And that's something which we have to take into account.
Maurice, I want you also to speak about what I call the fraud of the promotion of these NGOs. Let me mention, for instance, about Adamir before we wrap up Adamir. We are told that they offer free legal aid to political prisoners. And I'm asking, is that what they call the terrorists who are imprisoned for Israeli prison for murder? That they claim to work also to end torture. And as there's no torture in Israeli prisons, I assume they mean the torture of Palestinian prisoners in Palestinian detention centers, usually those that have been rounded up by the Palestinian Authority because they oppose the corrupt leadership of Mahmoud Abbas, as reported by no less than Human Rights Watch. And I advise our viewers to Google Human Rights Watch. They have a report entitled "Two Authorities, One Way, Zero Dissent." Subtitle is "Arbitrary Arrest and Torture Under the Palestinian Authority and Hamas." My question is, Morrison, do you know at all if Adamir has ever used European Union money or United Nations money to investigate the torture of Palestinian political prisoners in Palestinian detention camps?
So the answer is clearly no, Barry. When they define political prisoners, they are talking only about Palestinian terrorists arrested by Israel. They have no connection whatsoever to representing terrorists that would be ostensibly arrested by the Palestinian Authority. Now, I have to make two comments about your additional references. Firstly, the PFLP is a member of the PLO. No PFLP member has been arrested for charges or suspicion of terrorism against anyone by the PA. They simply don't arrest these terrorists. They just don't do that. Ahmed Saadat and the other murderers of Rehman and Zevi were only put in the prison in Jericho, which was really a luxury hotel, at the demand of the international community. Firstly, they'd been held up in the Muqata together with Yasser Arafat, and the price that Yasser Arafat had to pay for taking them out to prevent Israeli forces breaking into the Muqata, his compound, his presidential compound, was to agree to putting them in detention in the hotel in Jericho. Really, the PA, the Palestinian Authority, does nothing to do with the PFLP terrorists. The second comment I have to say is that the report that you recommend that the viewers read from Human Rights Watch must be read with a large pinch of salt. That report is nothing but a fig leaf in order to ostensibly justify Human Rights Watch's false claim that it really does deal with human rights as a whole and doesn't focus its true anti-Semitism and true Jew hatred only on Israel. That report that you mentioned was just a fig leaf to divert that really clear bias and Jew hatred of Human Rights Watch against Israel. And therefore, when you read the report, whilst the information that's contained therein is probably correct, the readers should understand that that report is simply a fig leaf.
Okay, now you also mentioned something that's very interesting before in accountability for all the money. What I find absolutely staggering is the European countries, their governments, their NGOs, the United Nations are pumping hundreds, if not billions of dollars into these so-called human rights Palestinian NGOs. And we're beginning to expose some of the fraud that's going on. And it really is quite amazing to me how naive and how careless these governments are in not getting accountability. Let me give you one example to corroborate what you said. Adamia made an application to get what's called consultancy status as the U.S. representative in the United Nations Economic and Social Council, and it was denied by the work of the United States representative to the committee, because it asked the NGO Adamia to clarify its affiliation to the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which Adamia couldn't do. And their request was rejected after it was repeatedly requested to respond. So here we have the United Nations denying access to Adamia because they were actively involved with the United Nations designated Palestinian Terrorist Organization. I'd like to make some comment about I can't believe that the European Union, in particular governments and their NGOs, do not know this and yet willingly give huge amounts of money to these fraudulent NGOs who are aiding and abetting terror organizations. What can you tell? What's your opinion of this?
So Barry, as I said before, the information that 99% of the information that I provided previously was information that is openly available on the website of NGO Monitor. The information is being brought to the attention of the relevant EU and UN officials, and they all simply chose to ignore the information. They chose to ignore the connections of those organizations to the PFLP, even though they were very, very clear, and they remain very, very clear. And it's sad that these organizations never did anything in order to try and investigate any one of these claims, in order to actually truly assess what the affiliations were, and really that all in breach of there's a general network of watchdogs on terror funding, and of an internationally recognized organization that deals with terror funding called TAFT, and their recommendation is that when assessing the activities of NGOs, countries and funds should show extreme caution because of the propensity to use these organizations in order to cover up terrorist affiliations. Now, these terrorist affiliations of these organizations were jumping off the page. And the organizations, the European Union, the UN, and all the other organizations that did work with all of these organizations simply chose to ignore those connections, to ignore the ties, and to continue their funding in the knowledge that these were PFLP affiliated organizations, and that the organization, the PFLP, had its main goal of destroying the state of Israel by murdering Jews.
You know, also, Morris, the Palestinians are really expert at picking names for their NGOs that simply pull at the heartstrings. You know, groups like, for instance, another one that's been banned, Defense for Children International Palestine. And that one, tell me about that one, but also at the same time, tell me about what's called the Bisan Center for Research and Development. I mean, it's quite innocuous. Why should anybody object to a Palestinian research and development organization? But I understand one of the executive directors is a person you may know personally, a man called Eteref Rimawi, if I've got his name right.
Yes, indeed. So let's maybe start off with Bisan. And here again, you have the connection of their senior members of Ubay Ubedi and then of Eteref Hajjaj. These are people who were just recently convicted of membership in the PFLP, and play an integral part in the PFLP activities. Ubedi was recently sentenced in June 2020 to 12 months in prison for being a member of the PFLP. He is the Bisan's executive director. Another member of the organization, Eteref Rimawi, also recently the High Court Israel's High Court referred to him as a PFLP member who posed a clear security threat to the region, and not in a vacuum, because of his PFLP membership and affiliation. He similarly served as another one of Bisan's executive directors. Now, when you see the senior staff of these organizations, and really much of, if not all of the staff, are these people who hold senior positions in the PFLP, and they are members of the PFLP, and they are also the heads of these organizations, you understand very quickly, as I explained before with Adamir, but maybe to a smaller extent here, that the identity of senior staff in these organizations with their membership in the PFLP is something which cannot be disconnected. DCI Palestine, on the other hand, DCI Defense of the Child International. So what the terrorists decided to do is, we're going to take an internationally recognized organization, we're going to abuse it for our purposes. So they take control of the local branch of Defense of the Child International. Who doesn't love defending children? Everybody loves defending children. It pulls at every heartstring. But then you look again at the staff and the people who are working for DCI Palestine, and you see incredible things. Firstly, a few years ago, they had a staff member called Hisham Abu Maria. Now, Hisham Abu Maria was a project coordinator involved in its community mobilization, had really a very intimate connection with much of the work that they did, much of the field work that DCI Palestine ostensibly did, until one day when Hisham Abu Maria was involved in violent attacks against Israeli forces and was killed. Suddenly, DCI Palestine's field worker took on a whole new identity when he was hailed by the PFLP as one of its great field commanders. Now, what do you mean he was one of their great field commanders? Was he working as a community mobilization for DCIP, or was he working as community mobilization for the PFLP? Is it possible to separate those off? If you have the understanding that attacking Israel as a child helps not only the violent effort against Israel and against Israelis, but also supports the international delegitimization of Israel in UN bodies and in the international communities, then you understand that when you're an organization that supports the terrorism on the one hand, and on the other, uses that information in order to present themselves as an organization which fights terrorism. Now, alongside the information that's provided on the website of NGO Monitor regarding DCI Palestine, there's also information on the website of Palestinian Media Watch, where I serve as the head of legal strategies. And there we saw recently an interview given by the head of DCI Palestine, a guy called Khalid Kuzmar. Now, what does the interview deal with? Just a year and a half ago, the EU, having really understood that much of what had been told about the connection of Palestinian NGOs to terrorist organizations was actually true, and the picture was becoming much clearer, the EU adopted a new funding clause, which said that every organization that receives funding from the EU must commit to the fact that their funds will not find their way into the hands of an EU-designated terrorist organization. Television interview, Khalid Kuzmar, the head of DCI Palestine. In the interview, he explains why he refuses to accept that conditional funding because it's political in its nature and would really subject the organization to backlash from the Palestinian Authority. Well, so I don't understand. What does that mean? Why can an organization which claims to be a human rights organization, claims to defend children, not immediately stand up and say, obviously we can accept a funding condition which says that none of the money that we're given will go to a terrorist organization? That shouldn't even be a question. It's an obvious. And when Khalid Kuzmar says that his organization, DCI Palestine, refuses to accept that conditional funding, it immediately should set off alarm bells and sirens for anyone who considers funding DCI Palestine. Now, once you have that connection between PFLP operatives, who are integrally part of the organization, and PFLP members who say that this organization is part of our network, and when the head of the organization says that he's not willing to accept a conditional funding because the funds that go through his organizations may actually find their way into the hands of EU-designated terrorist organizations, in other words, EU funding going straight to the PFLP, they create by themselves that linkage, and again, purely based on open source information. All you have to do is put the puzzle together. When you have activists in the organization who are actual terrorists, when you have a political organization that really defines the working of the organization and adds in that political aspect of using the information gathered, using the mobilization of the Palestinian children as a means not only to invoke terrorism and promote terrorism, but also as a means to then later attack Israel for its law enforcement against the Palestinian children, then you understand here that you have a branch of a terrorist organization that is integrally involved in the activities of that terrorist organization from both sides, mobilizing a population, in this case, the children and sending them off to commit acts of terrorism. And on the other hand, the political echelon using that same information and crying wolf about the children who are being arrested by Israel for involvement in terrorism as a means to achieve the goal of terrorism against Israel, as a means to destroy and to delegitimize Israel. That's DCI Palestine, and it doesn't matter how many times they claim that they are a human rights organizations. When you examine the affiliations time after time, other senior members, we'll talk about Shuan Jabarin in a minute and his connection to Al-Haq, but when you understand that the same names come up over and over again, Shuan Jabarin was previously a senior board member of DCI Palestine, you understand that these same people move around between the different organizations and they hold those same positions or more senior positions in each one of the organizations. Then you understand that you really have here a net of operatives, a tight net of operatives who really control every one of these organizations and have turned these organizations into conduits for supporting, promoting, funding the PFLP and in the continuance of funding terrorist activity against Israel. Again, all you need to do is to open your eyes, remove your blinkers, and put the pictures of the puzzle together. Open source information. Again, there is, I would assume, a wealth of additional intelligence, confidential information, but just when you consider the open source information, this already should be a clear indicator of these organizations' affiliation with the PFLP and their service for the PFLP. Now, when I talk about these organizations that move and the members of the organizations that move between organizations, we can talk about, again, Samer Arbid. Just as a reminder, Samer Arbid, the leading terrorist in the murder of Rina Schnoeb, August 2019. Samer Arbid is not only a member was not only active in Adamir, but then later moved on to another one of the organizations that was declared a terrorist organization, the UAWC. And here you have really a plethora of different people who are involved along the way. You have, again, Samer Arbid, who comes up as the accountant. You have, again, Ubay Obedi, the guy who was connected to Bisan. He's also active in UAWC. You now have another member of the PFLP whose name also comes into the picture. That's Abdel Razik Faraj. Now, the indictment against the murderers of Rina Schnoeb was really very extensive and described how these three terrorists, Samer Arbid and his two co-terrorists, made the bomb, chose the position of the attack, and then carried it out. But they had above them the three senior members of the PFLP who were in charge of them. One of them, Abdel Razik Faraj, he's part of the indictment against the PFLP terrorists, for being involved in the murder of Rina Schnoeb. Now he's acting together with Samer Arbid and Ubay Obedi, all of these people convicted PFLP terrorists who find themselves in each one of these different organizations, always integrally connected to the activities of the PFLP. And again, there we can carry on and give other names of the terrorists that are involved there, and continue on with each one of them, really going through one at a time and all together, painting this wider picture of PFLP involvement. Now you also have Walid Khanache. Walid Khanache also involved in these organizations, and also playing senior positions in the PFLP organizations, according to the indictment that Juana Rashmawi recently confessed to. There you have the story, how Walid Khanache, as a senior PFLP operative, terrorist, I know him personally. I've stood in court with Walid Khanache 15 years ago, 20 years ago, Already then he was a senior member of the PFLP. And when you see that Walid Khanacha sets up an entire financial process for bringing in donations and then taking those donations, falsifying accounts, and then using that money for terrorist activities, he's another one of these senior members in the PFLP that is again part of all of these organizations and running the organizations at the most senior level at the same time as holding the position, again, according to the indictment, that he was also indicted for the murder of Rina Schnerb. Walid Khanacha's position in that attack was that he was the person who provided the funding for the attack, not unsurprisingly. He's the money guy. He actually drove Samer Arbid from wherever it was to the point of where they were about to carry out the attack with the bomb in the car, knowing that Samer Arbid was about to carry out the attack. That's the level of his involvement, and that has to be understood. He is not a human rights activist. He is a cold-blooded murderer, and that has to be something which is clear. His affiliation with the PFLP is truly beyond any doubt whatsoever. And again, when you look on the side of Palestinian Media Watch, we put out a whole report on who are the terrorists from the PFLP who were on the list of to potentially be elected for the Palestinian Parliament. And here we find on the list of the PFLP, not surprisingly, Walid Khanacha. His connection to the PFLP is not something which, in any way, shape, or form, can in any way be questioned or misunderstood. Walid Khanacha is a PFLP terrorist in charge of the funding of the entire PFLP organization, including its terrorist activities, and he is also a member of the different organizations in different capacities of all of these different groups. Now, when we look at the other different groups that are involved here, we see those same really the same connections coming up over and over and over again. Senior PFLP members, UPWC, as one of the other organizations that was connected. We have Khitam Safin, who really, his also connection with the PFLP is not something which can be denied. His affiliation was clear also through his administrative detention, clear through his participation in events organized by the PFLP, and really confirmed even by statements of the PFLP when he was arrested. And the PFLP says that in a statement that their operatives were arrested by the Israeli forces. So here you have again that connection and that affirmation that from the organization itself, the PFLP itself is saying that the person who is a member and works for and is integrally involved with UPWC is a member of a terrorist organization. The affirmation comes from the terrorist organization itself, and we can go along with a lots of different other names in these organizations. But maybe we should jump to Al-Haq and to Shuan Jabarin, who we mentioned before. Al-Haq, Shuan Jabarin, has already been defined by Israel's Supreme Court as far ago back as 2007 as a senior member in a terrorist organization, in a manner of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, acting some of the time as a CEO of a human rights organization, and at the other times as an activist in a terrorist organization. Shuan Jabarin, his previous connection to, obviously, as I said, to DCI Palestine, is joined also in that connection through El-Haq, also by Hashem Abu Maria, the terrorist who worked as the mobilization unit for DCI Palestine, was also involved in Al-Haq. And you see again the same, really it's the same pattern over and over again, where you have an NGO who is staffed by predominantly and run by senior PFLP members. And those PFLP members are part of that senior echelon, really, of the PFLP. It's clear that the activities of the NGOs that they head are not something which is detached from their violent political affiliation, but really it's part of that integral terrorist affiliation to the PFLP, really a homicidal terrorist group that to this day is trying to murder Jews. That's the connections of each one of these groups, each one of them senior members playing central parts, obviously controlling the funding that's coming into the organizations from the international community so that that funding can be used clearly in part to hold some type of facade that these organizations are indeed doing some work. Whether any of that work is justified or whether any of that work is real is a whole different story, or whether any of that work justifies the size of their budget. And then you have the ability of those senior members in each one of these organizations to control where the funds come into and then where those funds go to. And when they all flow into the coffers of the PFLP, then you clearly have a very clear picture of a tentacled octopus, PFLP in the middle, and its tentacles, these NGOs pretending to be legitimate human rights organizations being fronts for gathering money. It's really like the crime syndicates having car parks or having a restaurant which poses as a facade for their and as a front for money laundering for their illegitimate activities. That's how the terrorist organizations work. It's not brain science, really, it's not. It's very simple when you just have to be willing to see the clear facts in front of your eyes and understand that when a senior terrorist heads an NGO and when the NGOs are staffed by other members of that same terrorist organization and the activities of those organizations support and promote the activities of the terrorist organization, then the clear picture is that these are terrorist organizations and their affiliation to the PFLP really is without any question. And that's, again, simply based on open source material of how these organizations work and who they're staffed by, their funding, how much was coming in, what activities they were conducting, and where that money was going
to. Continuing what you were saying about the Al-Haq NGO and Shawan Jabarin, I've got a couple of points to make here. And I got this from Palestine Media Watch, which you're the legal advisor of. I can't begin to tell you the amount of money that these organizations, like for instance Al-Haq, receive from, in my opinion, very, very naive or duplicitous, I'm not sure which, European governments. Because Al-Haq received, according to the records, a massive $7.2 million funded by Sweden for a project. They received a huge amount of money from Germany, something called Side by Side, Strengthening Civil Society Forces. And yet, neither Al-Haq nor the German government have come clean about the amount of money that flowed to Al-Haq and what they did with it. There's really an absence of accountability, the funding here, which is staggering. Coming back to Jabarin himself, he published a letter a year ago in 2020 saying that I Write to Resist, in which he criticized the EU's anti-terrorism clauses by claiming that not working with terror organizations could, listen to this, undermine the ability of Palestinian civil society organization to engage with the Palestinian society. So he is admitting here that Al-Haq is dealing with terror and terror organization in defiance of its European donors, and yet who persist to give him money all the time. It's absolutely amazing. And just to rub salt on the wound, Jabarin attended a memorial event organized by the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, honoring its Politburo member, Rabbi Mohana, who contributed to establishing several of these satellite NGOs that are now been designated as terrorist organizations. And yet it seems, I'm not surprised by the United Nations, but European governments, one after the other, are simply in denial. This is the point I think we have to make. But let's move on to another one. The Union of Agricultural Works Committee, UAWC. What could be more innocent than a Palestinian agricultural committee? Obviously, everybody wants the Palestinians have more food and everything. What can you tell us about UAWC?
So UAWC, Barry, I actually touched on it previously. Again, the same UAWC is Samar Arbid, the terrorist involved in leading the murder of Rina Schnerb. He is the accountant for UAWC. Abdel Razik Faraj, who I mentioned, also one of the senior PFLP, the three senior PFLP members, Khalida Jarrar, Abdel Razik Faraj, and Walid Khanache. They are the three senior members of the PFLP outside of the prison. And Ubay Aboudi, again from the Bisan Center. All of these same people coming together, and others. You can keep on naming more and more of these PFLP members who are then working for any one of these organizations, and really at the highest level. Abdel Razik Faraj doesn't. He is a PFLP terrorist. That's what he does. There is no way to separate his terrorist character and position from his day-to-day activities. Similar with Samar Arbid. Samar Arbid was the accountant for Adamir, then UAWC, and at the same time was building bombs and was murdering a little Jewish girl and trying to murder others. This is the integral connection of each one of these organizations, and really UAWC is no different on that front in any way, shape, or form. That's clearly something which has to be understood for there to be a clear picture of how these organizations actually work and how they form part of this more broad picture of the PFLP activities and the PFLP terror and its murder of Israelis and its goal to really to destroy Israel.
There are a couple of things I want to add about this Union of Agricultural Work Committees, by the way. And it goes again back to accountability for the money. Again, it points to what I keep mentioning all the time. According to Fatah, this is a Palestinian part of the Palestinian Authority. According to Fatah, this UAWC is officially affiliated to the Agricultural Arm of the Palestine Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and this is conferred by USAID. And obviously, as I said, the PFP is designated as a terror organization, as is now UAWC. And despite having received masses of funding from Spain, France, Netherlands, Norway, Oxfam, and the United Nations, it's amazing how many, again, European governments throw away their taxpaying money without demanding any accountability in return. And although Canada claimed it has stopped funding this organization, they have continued to throw money at it via the tune of, by the way, just over $15 million via the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, as does Denmark. Rather than develop their land, they seem to be obsessed with practicing policies and activism against Israel and pushing for anti-Israel actions rather than cooperation. By the way, you mentioned its leader, Samir Habib and Abdel Rajib Farah, attended, again, another memorial event organized by the Palestinian Front for the Palestinian Palestine. And they celebrated, by the way, something you mentioned earlier, Maurice. They celebrated, this is an innocuous NGO, isn't it? But they celebrated the 10th anniversary of the murder of the Israeli minister, Rachamam Zevi, by PFLP terrorists. So, how can they possibly be a terrorist organization? Incidentally, it's one of their leaders, Ismat al-Shuli, was in prison for 7 years as a PFLP leader. And Bashir al-Kari, former president of the UAWC, was convicted of terrorist offences and jailed for 15 years. And he was, by the way, on the side, the head of the PFLP Politburo. So let's move on to, I think, perhaps the last one we're talking about tonight. And that is going to be the Union of Palestinian Women's Committee, UPWC. Fatah calls it an affiliate of the PFLP again. And it's also, this one also condemned by USA. What can you tell us about this Women's Committee?
So again here, Barry, I also mentioned them previously. Here you have, again, the list of senior members of the organization who are all involved integrally with PFLP activities and hold senior positions in the PFLP and who have been arrested and convicted of membership in the PFLP. That's the common really cause the common factor that you see all the way through. And in some cases, you have external sources that are talking about these organizations and clearly identifying them as affiliates of the PFLP. If here you go through the list of activists, again, it's information on the website of NGO Monitor, a list of different PFLP activists who are integrally involved in PFLP activities, doing the same things again and again, where you see the officers of these organizations really serving as hubs for PFLP activities, whether it's at the most basic level, when Israeli forces raid the offices of the UPWC and they find pictures of the PFLP leaders and PFLP flags, and it's something which gives you that very, very basic indication, unless you're willfully blind. I don't know how many people at home or watching this broadcast or watching this recording have contraband material that belongs to a terrorist an internationally designated terrorist organization just laying around on their shelves. Now, that's something that you have at home, possibly, you know what? But when you have a human rights organization, well, when does that happen? In which human rights organizations are there pictures of and materials of terrorist organizations and homicidal terrorist organizations that are internationally designated and recognized as terrorist organizations? So you take really the very, very basic things. Now, someone might say, well, that's trivialization of a declaration of an organization as a terrorist organization. Fine, I accept that. You don't declare an organization as a terrorist organization simply because they had terrorist information and terrorist materials in their offices. But when you then look again at their employees, the people who run the organization, who direct the organizations, and understand that their affiliation with terrorist organization is really something which is quite clear, then you understand that what you're dealing here with is a pattern of organizational development by a terrorist organization saying, we want these tentacles to operate in all different spheres, whether it be health work, whether it be agriculture, whether it be women's work, whether it be defending terrorists, whether it be defending children. Every one of the tentacles goes in the same place. But at the end of the day, the tentacles are guided by the head, are guided by the octopus, are guided by the PFLP. And that you see again with every one of the organizations.
Maurice, I want to end with this by telling you that in preparation for this, I was talking with Boaz Ganor. You know him. He's the founder of the International Counter-Terror Organization at IDC Herzliya. And he told me in preparation for the show, sorry, in his expert opinion, these 6 NGOs should be defined as organizations that sponsor terrorism, which they do, as we've clearly outlined in this show. And this, he says, is a felony in itself. I want to hear your closing remarks, and I want to thank you, Maurice, for your participation and your knowledge on this very important subject.
So, Barry, what I hope I made clear already in my opening remarks, and with this, I would like maybe to sum up. Anyone who looks simply at the open source information that is clearly and openly available can define and recognize the identity between these NGOs and the PFLP. It's not by accident that every single one of these NGOs has a central connection to the PFLP. Now, much of that information is open source information, and much of that information can be shown and really presented as I've presented it, and as anyone can read it on the websites that I've already mentioned. You can see those connections. To ignore those connections, you really have to be willfully blind. Now, doesn't mean that only and solely based on that information, it is possible to declare every one of these organizations as a terrorist organization. Certainly not. There is a wealth of additional security information which cannot be shared openly with the public, definitely will never suffice the appetite of journalists who their inherent bias against Israel is already clear, and therefore they'll look and say, well, this is all that there was. This is all that Israel provided in order to justify the designation of these 6 organizations as terrorist organizations. So to them, I would say a few comments. Firstly, your bias prevents you from seeing the real picture because the real picture was very, very clear. Secondly, when you simplify the idea of a designation of a terrorist organization only to and restrict it only to open source information, you are inherently being anti-Jewish and anti-Israel, because that is not the way any other country in the world addresses the subject of designating organizations, including civil society organizations, including ostensible human rights organizations, as terrorist organizations. Every country will rely not only on open source information, but also on intelligence information that will never be exposed and presented to the world in open sources. That's the nature of fighting terrorism. We are not holding here a trial against a specific individual for an act that he committed in the past. We're saying that these organizations are terrorist organizations, their goals are terrorist goals, and their integral working shows clearly that they are really a hydra with multiple heads, but all connected via that octopus-like structure to the same body, where they use, similar to organized crime, where they use ostensibly legitimate facades and front organizations as a means to bring in funding and to then whitewash and to launder the funding that's given in order to support the cause of and the goals of the violent terrorism.
Thank you, Maurice. Thank you for your contribution with this. I'd like to end viewers by this. I think, as we pointed out here, in a normal world, these NGOs, you could define them as being both an extortion and a distortion racket. And yet, as we know, this thing is going on. So I put it this way, and I address this to European governments who are funding money non-stop at these NGOs. You either know the true nature of these Palestinian NGOs, and you continue to pump money at them anyway, in which case you are guilty with your funding, with aiding and abetting terror against Israel, or you don't know about the decades of financial fraud going on, in which case you are totally incompetent. Look, we have listed here some of the examples of mass fraud and real intent of these NGOs who double as conduits and financiers for Palestinian terror. And now we've taken the first step of giving you the evidence and giving this in fairly lengthy video. And I hope you will take this to heart, use it in helping to support the truth of what we're giving you from Israel, and please share the video. This is Barry Shaw for the Israel Institute of Strategic Study and The View from Israel, saying thank you very much, and thanking our guest Morris for his contribution as well. Goodbye.
Thank you, Barry.
אנו מכריזים בזאת